Hi all and welcome to Esri Australia's onboarding webinar number 2, implementing GIS into your curriculum. So a little bit about myself before we jump into it. My name's Jacob Lovejoy and I look after the education program at Esri Australia. So my job essentially is to really support schools, teachers like yourselves and students or even classes at a time in their adoption and their engagement with ArcGIS. Now that geospatial technology is a large part of the geography curriculum. Prior to my stint at Esri Australia, I was, and I guess I still am, a registered teacher in Queensland. And my subject areas were senior history, modern and ancient. And then as a byproduct of that, I taught junior geography and junior history as well as a little bit of PE and English, because why not when you work in the state system? I'm sure that most of you have this by now, but if you did need to reach me at any time, feel free to reach out to my email at education@esriaustralia.com.au, and I'm more than happy to help out or work out some further ways to support you guys too, whether that's a Zoom meeting or a virtual, a Teams meeting, something like that, or a site visit. That pretty much sums up me. So today's webinar focuses on implementing GIS into your school's curriculum, and it is designed as an onboarding webinar. So I do notice that there are a couple of names that were in the latest round of receiving an ArcGIS subscription or license for their school this year. And some of you may be a little bit more experienced or have had it for a while. That's all right. I'm sure you'll still get something out of it. But if you are an experienced user, this is just, I guess, a bit of a forewarning that this is designed to support new schools and teachers to the program. So what are we looking at in this webinar? We're going to look at how GIS is outlined in the curriculum standards, both in junior and senior geography, because I think it's important for us to note what we need to be doing as educators and as teachers. And then we're going to look at some specific examples and specific applications of how you could be using geospatial technology in your junior years and then in your senior years as well. I'm happy for you guys to ask questions throughout. I won't stop and answer them as they come through necessarily, but every 10 to 15 minutes I'll have a look and address a couple at a time. Otherwise there'll be question time at the end as well. And if you were hoping to, I guess, have a copy of this webinar presentation today, you can actually copy that URL, and this is the story map that I'll be presenting on today. So everything that you see on your screen is essentially on this URL, and that'll appear at the bottom too, or at the end of the presentation. So if you don't get it down now, I'll make sure I give you enough time at the end as well to copy that down. All right, so let's jump into it. What does the Australian curriculum specify or state about geospatial technology? When it comes down to it, it essentially mandates the exposure to and the use of GIS technology, and it's referenced under the geographical inquiry and skills strand. So if we read a couple of examples that I've snipped and taken from the Australian Curriculum's website, students are essentially to represent spatial distribution of geographical phenomena by constructing special purpose maps that conform to cartographic conventions using spatial technologies as appropriate. Second example, students will interpret geographical data and other information using qualitative and quantitative methods and digital and spatial technologies as appropriate to identify and propose explanations for spatial distributions, patterns, and trends, and infer relationships. And I know that we as teachers are probably very good at going, oh, there's some keywords there. As appropriate is something that we probably like to see, because I guess sometimes it means there's a bit of an out for us, depending on what we think is appropriate. But I guess I bring this to our attention now because the reality is geography is moving in a technological direction, in a digital direction. Maps that were found in atlases and in textbooks, whilst they can still be useful, can be very quickly outdated. You know, earthquake data 3 years ago that you can find in a textbook, is useful, but I can actually access current earthquake data that's updated every couple of days using geospatial technologies. So I think these words as appropriate. If we're doing our jobs as teachers well, it's becoming more and more necessary. So using geospatial technologies, and this isn't to guilt trip anyone, it can be scary. I definitely think that as appropriate is us doing our jobs well and serving our teaching and learning goals properly. What does the senior geography syllabus say about GIS? I'm completely aware that each state has its own syllabus. However, after looking at a number of them, GIS features prominently across them. The Queensland syllabus, and I've taken this one because I am based in Brisbane, mentions the use of spatial technologies in all 4 of its units. So here's another snippet. Students will use spatial technologies to create and annotate maps at an appropriate scale using area, color, shading, etc. They will use data to create maps and map layers using spatial technologies, and they'll use spatial technologies to analyze these layers and explain relationships. Now, I'm not saying that you need to be using ArcGIS. I know that things like Google Maps, EpiCollect, there are a range of other geospatial technologies out there. If ArcGIS is the best tool for the job on a given day, then use ArcGIS. If it's not, I'm more than happy for you to use something else. Geospatial technologies also comes through in the subject matter for each unit as outlined in the syllabus. So students recognize hazard zones and represent these on a map in brackets using spatial technologies. If we look down, they'll manipulate, adapt, and transform data using spatial technologies. So it's actually quite, it appears quite a lot in the Queensland senior syllabus. Here's an example from the Victorian senior syllabus. So on geospatial technologies, students will create simple layers. They will use layers to illustrate and assist with analysis and relationships, and they'll manipulate the interface of the GIS platform in use. So viewing data at different scales, adding and removing layers, viewing and hiding data layers. So as you can see, through the 4 or 5 snippets that we've just talked through, geospatial technology, and I guess it's the instruction that it be used is quite apparent and quite prevalent throughout. I'm not sure about the Victorian criteria sheets, but I know for the Queensland criteria sheets, which are called ISMGs, it features quite prominently in, I think it's the communicating criterion. So if students aren't creating these maps, it's going to be really hard to give them a good communication mark when it comes to that communicating criteria. So just something to think about as well. So with that in mind, and now that we've established that geospatial technologies is essentially a must for us to be doing and for our students to be experiencing, let's have a look at GIS in the teaching and learning process. So it does feature strongly in both junior and senior syllabuses. It is specified. What are some added advantages? It's the way of essentially the present and the future, and we touched on that textbook example a little bit earlier. Being able to access up-to-date data all the time, being able to turn layers on and off instantly, it's just such a huge advantage. GIS is also used in almost every industry, and I'll just show you on our website. I'm not going to go into it, but I'm just hovering over the industries tab, and you can see how wide and evident GIS is. It's being used in agriculture, architecture, logistics and freight, law enforcement. We've got our schools, we've got Indigenous groups and organizations using it. Health is using it. It's just so prevalent in a lot of industries. I could click on any of these as well. I'll click on agribusiness, and we have case studies here and little videos that explain how it's being used as well. So it's quite pervasive. It's in everything. So if we're setting up our students for success and for their future university courses, something we need to be aware of. And probably the best advantage is that it's reinforcing academic rigor, it's reintroducing it to the subject of geography, and it sparks interest. Students love using technology. It's often that we as teachers can be a little bit afraid of using it, but I've found that, yeah, if we give our students the chance to use it, they usually jump on board pretty quickly. And this academic rigor one's a big one. I know that in my previous school, I think geography, I know that history was often on the same line as something like, physics or chemistry, and we would always lose those, what we deemed those smart students, those academic students, to physics and chemistry instead of choosing humanities-based subjects. Well, introducing this geospatial technology gives us the chance to really capture those academic students and retain those academic students in the senior years too. All right, so we're going to go through some specific examples for each year level. So you can see geospatial technology in action, so it's not so much an abstract thought. We can see what it looks like. So we're going to look at one more example moving forward, and then I'm going to stop with the Australian curriculum snippets. So what does the Australian curriculum say about GIS in year 7? It says we need to use it to represent data and interpret data, but it has those keywords with and without, or as appropriate. So again, it's us being making judgments as to when it's important to include and when we don't necessarily need to include it. But I think the onus is on us as educators to make sure we are including it. And I just need to make sure that I'm back on page 1. So we're going to run with a bit of a running context as we go throughout, and I'm just going to explain how I would perhaps approach GIS in each year level and some opportunities that exist. So how can I begin to implement GIS into the classroom for year 7, unit 1, water in the world? If we picture year 7s rocking up to high school in the first term, we know that they are slow. They have issues with IT during the first couple of weeks. They have issues logging into their computers for the first couple of weeks. And even when they do manage to do that, they seem to work at an excruciatingly slow pace when they're on the computer. With that in mind, can we still use GIS? Absolutely. However, I would advise with that slow pace, and maybe your school is different than mine, your year 7s were different than mine, and if so, take some of what I say and leave some of what I say, but I would be using GIS especially when they first arrived to high school, as a teacher-led and explored initiative. So I'd be using it by essentially displaying these layers, this data up on the interactive whiteboard, and getting students to work from whatever lesson plan, whatever other resources I have, answering questions in their books or on their own devices, but the data would be up on the board for all to see, so I don't need to wait for them to access it. I don't need to wait for 25 students to access the same map and whatnot before I continue on. So my advice would be, in order to do that well, is to access some of what already exists free for you guys. So we've got a range of learning materials and activities to supplement your unit plans and your lessons. They're made by teachers, a lot of them are made by me, and I've made sure that I've tied everything to the Australian curriculum really well. But they're there for you to use, and I'll show you a couple of examples. So this is our schools site, and I'll share that URL at the end as well again. But if I click over to learning materials and I search by year 7 and geography, we've got a couple of resources here. So if I'm looking at water, forms and their availability, which is also the map displayed on my presentation, I can click on that, and that URL in the gray box will take me to the map. So I've created the mapping resource for you, the geospatial component, and I've also created a lesson plan. Whether you use the lesson plan as is up to you. You might like to adapt it to suit your specific schooling needs, but I've included questions and answers for teachers and students you could distribute to your students the student worksheet, which is essentially the same document but without the nice green answers there. And you could either print that off for them and they can work from it in class, or they could perhaps have the student worksheet in front of them on their computers whilst you display the nice big map on your screen. So this is the map. There are more layers than what's displayed in the actual lesson plans map, but I've turned on one layer for us and we're looking at major aquifers in the world. And this layer shows how those aquifers are managing in terms of whether they're recharging the amount of water that they've lost or that has been used from them, whether they're actually being depleted over time. So something like this even is a really useful visual to explore water scarcity and water stress in the globe. We can notice that around the Middle East and India, there's a high level of water stress and water scarcity, whereas places that seem to be near the equator or just south of it seem to actually, their aquifers seem to be recharging. So my advice would be, yes, when they're really slow, have those geospatial technologies, the maps up on your screen, and work from something like a pre-prepared question sheet or some kind of Word document with your students. And that way you can just keep it moving rather than get bogged down with the technology and with them trying to open up different tabs and whatnot. So that's one example. You saw that there were a couple of other resources for Year 7s there. And if you ever have a resource that you think might be a great idea for me to create, I'm more than happy to hear it and look at creating that for you. So Year 7, Unit 2, Place and Livability. Let's continue on with our theme. The Year 7s are now settled in. They seem to have control and a bit of speed over their IT and computer logging credentials. And they've acclimatized to the pace of high school. Yes, they're probably still quite slow, but they're moving at a pace now. So the use of GIS is still teacher-led and explored as a class, so I'd still be using that interactive whiteboard method. But there's an option that now that they're a bit faster, that you might continue to use those lesson plans or whatnot, or maps you create yourselves and distribute to your students, and you might be looking at small groups or pairs, and they can work in that manner where they've got the mapping resource, on their screen, and they can answer the questions in their book, and that way you can move around and it's not so labor intensive on you sitting at the front of the room going through the technology on the board. They should have a feel after watching you navigate the maps on the board. They should have a bit of an idea of how they can do that themselves now that they've watched you do it. I know that a common assessment piece for Year 7 is a fieldwork task where students need to explore the livability of their local area or their school, usually looking at environmental and social livability. So with that in mind, my advice, and another way that you could be using ArcGIS or geospatial technology in this particular unit, is to digitize your survey. So instead of your students going out with, however the survey is designed, going out and recording results on a paper-based survey, if you digitize the survey using Survey 123, which is one of our field apps, and some of you may have come along to the Survey 123 webinar last Thursday, you can actually digitize that data, and that data will automatically be uploaded to one of those maps. And then you can manipulate it, you can style it certain ways, symbolize the data certain ways, and essentially distribute that to your students. You might take screenshots of the map with different feature layers on it and email it to your students to include in their reports, or to glue into their paper-based field report, however you do it. This is just a really basic example of a survey that I did in about 5 minutes, but you can get, the great thing about Survey 123 is it's all geotagged. You create your first question and make sure that there's a mapping-based question at the start. So place the geo point in this case, on the garden you are currently observing. So how healthy are gardens in your school. They find the garden that they're currently looking at by searching their school or their current location, and then they answer questions about it. So how many pieces of litter are evident in your garden? Give the quality of the soil in the garden a rating, and you might have some qualifiers as to how they measure that, and describe the health of the plant life with regards to the following. And then they just have to click, oh, the leaves look healthy, the stem trunk looks a bit average, and the roots aren't doing too well. And then they hit that submit button. And once all the data has been collected, you can have a look on a map, bring that data in on a map, and then have a look at those results and style them accordingly. And if you did want to have a look at that Survey 123 webinar, it's available on our PD page. We have a recording of it there, so you can have a little bit more of a look into Survey 123 there in your own time. But that's a really good tool for assessment, and it's nice and easy. Survey 123 is really simple and easy to use as a student as well, so they shouldn't be too confused with the process too. And you can even have a couple of practice goes with some silly or fun surveys in class. Using GIS in Year 8. So Year 8s now understand the expectations and the pace of high school. The use of GIS in this year will be used to mainly support the teaching of geographical content. However, there is opportunity to use it in assessment, particularly assignments, not so much the exams. I know that most of us are probably using some kind of form of the exam that our state may have distributed, or that the Australian curriculum may have distributed. But the use of GIS is still teacher-led and explored as a class. I know that I like my lessons to be really hands-on. I like to be really involved. Yes, there's times where you step back and they work independently, but my approach was always quite hands-on. But you know, we can work with students accessing those learning materials individually. Now they should know the process if you've instilled it in Year 7. They should be able to just work through them themselves, or as a class, or in small groups. And I'll just show you what do we have for Year 8, some learning materials. So we've got volcanoes, a lesson on volcanoes, a lesson on beach management strategies, protecting the Gold Coast, hotspots in the Hawaiian Islands, making mountains, plate tectonics and earthquakes, and volcanoes and plate boundaries. So a lot of this is targeting that Unit 1, landscapes and landforms, or something. I think that's what it's called off the top of my head. But we have a quick look at this beach management strategies one. This one's a little bit different to the typical maps. So this one's built in a story map and explores the Gold Coast's history of erosion, damage to the dune system. It's got some swipe maps, so showing the Gold Coast in 1955 to 1977, and I can blow that up so that it's nice and big as well. But that's really nice to show on the interactive whiteboard. Again, more from 1997 to 2020. Breaks down erosion. So this is really good for just teaching content. Erosion as an economic, social, and environmental threat. And then we bring in a really basic map and look at beach management strategies on the Gold Coast. So first one, we're looking at rock groins, and I've got an image of it. I explain what they are. And if I look on the map, I can actually see a rock groin here at the top of Tallabudgera Creek, and I've got a couple along the beach if I move around on it. And you just essentially go through rock walls at Burleigh. So the map just moves with the content. Dredging, so we can see some of the effects of dredging, and dumping and bulldozing. So it's just exploring different parts on the map and different strategies. But this is an example of geospatial technologies used really, really simply. So a lot of the content would be content you're teaching anyway in class, but we've added a little bit of a map element so that we can explore these strategies a little bit closely. This one's a good one. I like this one, the construction of the artificial reef. So this is just satellite imagery. and we can see the reef there, and I've highlighted it with an arrow. We could talk about before the reef was there, damaging tides and damaging weather. The water would actually breach the beach and hop into the Nerang River, which arcs around here. And that reef actually protects the Nerang River there. So a really simple story map with a simple map, but you're using geospatial technologies, and there's a lesson plan there if it suits your lesson goals. Another example, so this is the one with the Hawaiian Islands here, but you can use maps with feature layers. So this, I've just turned on all of the layers, I think, for this map, but we've got our tectonic plates marked by the red, the blue, and the black lines. And I've added my own arrows in so you can see converging, diverging, and transform plate boundaries, but the colors represent that anyway, so I didn't need to add them in. We've also got our volcanoes represented by the triangles, and we can work out what type of volcano they are. And we can look at, using the plate boundaries, we can identify the Pacific Ring of Fire as well with these volcanoes. And then lastly, I've turned on the hotspots layer. So this is actually the path of the hotspot that lies under the Hawaiian Islands over however many millions of years. I'm pretty sure its current direction as well, and how it relates to the plate movement of the Pacific plate boundary. But this stuff was all relatively easy to find. I didn't create any of this data. It was available on ArcGIS Online for me to go and grab and add to a map. And then, like we were talking about, sometimes all you need is satellite imagery to look at things like land cover and land use and explore that as a class. Year 8, Unit 2, Changing Nations. Again, you can utilize or build maps in ArcGIS Online that explore things like interstate migration, megacities, and push and pull factors. So here we've got a map that is showing megacities in the year 2018. And if I had more recent data, I could update that as well. So it shows proportional circles based on the size of the city. And then I've also just chucked on a GDP per capita layer, sorry. We can look at places like Australia, Japan, and Canada, London, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, these kinds of places here, and how their GDP is doing really well. But what do we notice is absent? There's no megacities. Is there a relationship there? Well, we can discuss that and explore that as a class and with supporting content. How else could you be using it? Using those story maps to communicate a topic or to communicate content. I know that at my previous school, we looked at Jakarta as a bit of a case study for this unit for Changing Nations and how Jakarta was addressing its economic, its environmental, its social problems or issues, things like overpopulation, clean drinking water, etc. I just built a story map that explored it sometimes with maps. Other times this big media piece was a video or an image, but it helps to communicate that content. Students can still copy notes down into their books. You can still ask questions in this content here. I guess it's just a PowerPoint, but better. The good thing about it is I can have this huge media piece and I can fit as much information on the left-hand side without worrying about, is there too much information on this PowerPoint screen? Because I know that's a big issue with PowerPoint. We often want to put enough text on it, or enough text that we need our students to write down or to record, that it can cost engagement, as our media pieces often have to become smaller. I could have this panel here 50-50 split as well, so that it actually came out to about here and split the text and the media in half. I guess there's also room for that survey, for survey 1, 2, 3 as well. I know that we looked at internal migration as an assignment, and students were required to survey their immediate family members, so their parents or their guardians, looking at where they may have migrated from, whether that was overseas or interstate. and the push factors and pull factors that influence that decision. So it was really great seeing a map where we had, parents from areas from South America, all through Southeast Asia, some in Africa, Europe, wherever it happens to be, see how diverse their class really is, their classmates' families are. But then I could click on a particular point and I could bring up information like push factor 1 might have been, let's say, war. I should have probably chose somewhere like Libya. But push factor 1 might have been war, push factor 2 might have been scarcity of water. And then I can still see, pull factor 1 was safety and security. Pull factor 2 was access to clean drinking water, or for whatever happens to be their answer. And the great thing is you can keep it sensitive by not asking, or by designing your survey so that it doesn't ask for a student's or a parent's name. That way student data or parent data can be anonymous too. And that way you don't have to have any, I guess, awkward conversations in class as well. So that's an option too. GIS in year 9. Year 9 geography. Subject definitely becomes a bit more rigorous at year 9. I know that a lot of schools actually stop offering geography after year 8. I don't know how, because it says that it needs to be taught till year 10, but even with that said, schools can't just, there's not enough students or involved in the subject, or it just dies out for whatever reason. I know that not all schools choose to offer it. So it does become a little bit more rigorous for those schools that are still offering it anyway. But how are we using our spatial technologies? Continue that class and independent use of the learning materials, but it probably becomes a little bit more about assessment, about using that GIS to support assessment or to support practice field work lessons or whatnot, or to teach content even. So if we have a look, we'll see what year 9 has for us. I don't know. Oh, that's an error that should have disappeared, but it's there. We've got biomes and climate graphs, so that's a content-based lesson. Chocolate's bitter taste, so that's interconnections and probably looking at the trade industry. Same with cobalt mining and child labor, I'm pretty sure from memory. Palm oil, Nike. Where does Nike get all of its I guess components, its shoes from? And modern slavery. And I'll show you this example here. So this is a map from the Nike one, but built this map so we can explore layers like GDP per country, and I've got a legend here that will tell me everything as well. If I turn that one off, global companies that are in the top 200 and where they're distributed worldwide. We can see that America has a lot of them. China seems to have a few as well, but most other countries don't have that many. And I could click on that data, as well. So 75 of the top 200 are listed in America, are based in America. Nike global headquarters, where are they based? So we've got one over here in Oregon, the Netherlands, and Shanghai, as well as a Converse store in Boston too, which is interesting because we look, okay, these are all, well, maybe not so much China, but these other areas are what we would call well-to-do off countries. But then we look at Nike stores worldwide. Again, most of them in Europe, or they're pretty much everywhere. There's a distinct lack in Africa. Making a shoe. So where are parts of the shoe made? I can click on each one. Malaysia makes the rubber component. China, the leather component. Nike factory workers. This is where we start to get some good discussions going. We've got workers in America, but where's the real part of their workforce? In Southeast Asia. And if we take it one step further, now that we know it's in Southeast Asia, how much are these people getting paid? Well, China, they're getting paid $2.65. I would assume that's a day, whereas if they're being built in Australia, almost $40, which explains why they're all working in Southeast Asia. And then we can turn this one on and look at child labor in the textile industry, and another point of discussion too. I know that speaking of something like this, the Geographies of Interconnections assessment task is a research assignment where students are required to research a global corporation like Nike or Samsung. So there's no reason students couldn't build something similar in ArcGIS Online with of course the support of a teacher guiding them. And they might not have all of this data, but having some of the data displayed, like where a Nike store's located, putting in the global headquarters, where are the different parts of the shoe or the product made. These are things that students can do quite easily once they've completed their research. And then you might help them source this kind of data, like child labor and textile pay rates. Biomes and food security, again, I'd be using that to teach content predominantly. But if you're designing your own exam, there's no reason you can't create your own maps with your own feature layers and then essentially take a snapshot and put it in their exam as a stimulus that they need to respond to questions. Are there any questions at this stage before we jump into year 10 through to 12? If there is, feel free to type them in. Otherwise, I'll continue to keep on going. Give it a couple of seconds. Awesome. We'll continue on. And if you do have a question, I'll try and get to it as we go. GIS in Year 10 Geography is what is quite important in my eyes. If students are still participating in Year 10 Geography, this is our opportunity to set them up for what's expected of them in senior school, as well as hopefully engage them and persuade them to choose geography as a senior subject when they do choose that later in the year. Sherry, I will answer your question now. Are there lesson plans available for all of these? Absolutely. So everything that I displayed today is available somewhere in this learning materials page. And again, I'll share that URL at the end, but it's all in here. Again, my background is history as well, so I've started creating a bunch of history resources, which I'm assuming that most of us here are probably also teaching history. You might find something that you like in there too. I've tried with maths and science, but if you're anything like me and you're humanities trained, yeah, I can do some stuff with it, but it's not super exciting to me just because that's not where my interests lie. But I am trying to build a maths and science resources too. But they're all available there. Yep. As I was saying, GIS becomes really important. Senior syllabus, as we touched on earlier, specifies the use of GIS in all 4 units more often than not, and in the criteria that they're marked on in their assessment pieces. So with that in mind, they need to have an idea of how to use it when they get into year 11 and 12. And if your students aren't using it, again, please don't take this as condemnation. Everyone is on a journey with this, and yeah, there are teachers that are well and truly on the journey, but the reality is most teachers are beginning or starting out with their exploration of this, so it's going to take time for us to get on top of it. But I think that year 10 is a really good practice ground to instill in our students some of the skills that they're going to need for senior school. So my advice would be that the teaching and learning process in year 10 incorporates not only like the use of lesson plans or following these lesson plans, but also the use of them creating their own little maps. And they don't have to be big maps. It might be simple tasks like, hey, we're all going to log into ArcGIS Online, and you've already found the data that they're going to use, but we're going to search for this data and we're going to add it to a map. Cool, let's save that work and close ArcGIS Online. It can be a 15-minute task, but just getting them to create those really basic maps where they're getting a feel for it, and they're reinforcing those skills that are going to be needed for year 11 and 12. So things like creating practice maps, creating those practice surveys, and continued exposure to lesson activities. The environmental change and management unit in year 10 is a fieldwork assessment piece. Often it focuses on either beach management and protection or waterway management and protection. Because you're out in the field, it's a really good opportunity to use our field apps like Survey 123, which we were discussing earlier, or I should have updated this, Collectors Know More, but quick capture or field maps. And again, not to toot the horn, but we have upcoming webinars on both of those field apps too. But a really good opportunity to get them to be using these apps, because these are the kinds of apps, whether it's Survey 123 or EpiCollect, which is another brand, they're going to be using it in some kind of way, or should be using it in some kind of way for their assessments. So getting them to collect photos of sites, record data, and take notes in things like Survey 123 is going to be really useful and hold them in good stead for senior school. And then you can look at that data in ArcGIS Online, make further notes, add further layers to support the data you've collected in the field. Unit 2, Geographies of Interconnections. My understanding is that the assessment is a research assignment. So instead of going through the fieldwork component, we find the data that we need online. Some of it's going to be freely available on ArcGIS Online. Other data is going to be freely available, but we're going to have to go looking for it. Things like, I'm not going to click on any of these, but World Bank or National Map or Geoscience Australia, we're going to have to go and look for our data, ABS, and then we're going to have to import that data into ArcGIS Online. Another question, what is the best app for collecting photos and data in the field? Good question. It depends on how complex you want to make your survey. My advice would be that you stick with Survey 123. I'll show you an example very quickly. I do know that I did explore it the other day. So this is one that I'm working on with a school at the moment, but get the students to measure out a 10 by 10 meter quadrat. So they're going to measure it with a tape measure at the actual field site, but they're also the person doing this survey is going to walk the perimeter and essentially map that quadrat to this map here. They're going to specify what quadrat they're collecting data from, and then they're going to answer questions like air temperature, wind speed, surface temperature, light intensity, pH, salinity, and submit the survey, sorry. So this isn't too complex of a survey, but if the data that you want them to collect is really complex and long, you might need to either consider making multiple surveys in Survey 123 or something like field maps, which combines the survey form as well as a map that they can see on their phone. So they can actually see something like this map, and they can put a point in here, and they can put a polygon in here, and whatnot, and answer questions about each of them. My encouragement would be to come along to those other two field apps webinars if you can. Again, so once they've found their data, they can style it according to how they want it to look. So this is a really basic example of a senior assessment task that I helped out with. Now that I look at it, I should have really chosen a different color for the really small dots. But the dots, the circles represent confirmed cases of Ebola in Democratic Republic of the Congo health districts. And that data is not just going to be sitting there on ArcGIS Online. We had to go looking for it. I think we found it on World Health Organization from memory, but it had X and Y coordinates, which allowed us to map it to the data, to the map as well. So find the data, and then hopefully put it on the map is for that research assignment anyway. Another question? No, no worries. Senior geography. Again, we've been building up to it. It's necessary that students are continuously exposed to GIS and spatial technologies so that they're successful in senior, but also so that they maintain in senior. My encouragement would be to be using it in the lead up to an assessment task where possible. Again, even if it's only 10, 15-minute activities or homework activities, just continuing to use it so that it doesn't get to the assessment part and they've gone, oh no, I know I need to do this right to get an A. You know, being able to use it in small opportunities throughout the term is going to hold them in good stead for their assessment when they need to build their own maps, create their own maps, add their own data. You could even, if you're designing your own exams, which I know we all, in Queensland, we have to do, each assessment piece has to be unique. There's no reason you can't build your own map and essentially screenshot whatever map extent you want with the data on it and use that as a source or a stimulus piece in which you can build questions around as well. I know that some schools have done, some teachers have done that. So what this is showing here is precipitation at this level. So if I've got questions based on precipitation, I might have a second set of data that I add to this. I can build some questions around that for an assessment piece in the senior school, an exam question in the senior school. Field reports, again, much the same as year 10, using those field apps where possible, because those field apps will speak directly to ArcGIS Online. As I collect data in the field, I could have my ArcGIS Online map open and watch them essentially populate the map as well in a geotagged location too. That can be super local or it can be state or national or international as well. And then I know that some schools are using story maps to actually get their students are using story maps to submit their final assessment piece as well. So this is what we call a story map that I've been working through in this presentation today. And students have actually been building their entire field report in here. They've got their introduction, their context, their field work steps, you know, their method, sorry, that's the word I'm looking for, their method, and they've got their data findings, which they might, you know, they might import an image of a table or a graph, or they might import the map that they've been using, and they have the large piece of media on one side, whilst they have their analysis and justification on the other side. And sometimes it's just a simple image too. But it's great because you can be reading what they say and you can actually engage with the map. So you can click on the legend, you can zoom in on the data, and you can actually click on that data too to look at their fields. So if I was to have a survey, if I was to be looking at survey data here, each of these fields would essentially be questions in my survey. So one of these suspected cases might read pH level, light intensity, and so on. And I can see all that data there too. So I can actually confirm what their analysis is saying at the same time. And the same process again with the data reports. Finding that data online through your research and then adding it to a map, you know, creating choropleth maps and whatnot, and then using the story maps to present that report. I think in the senior school, it really, ArcGIS or the use of geospatial technologies becomes less about exploring content, like those volcanic hazards in the Pacific Ring of Fire, for instance, and much more about supporting assessment. Where students can demonstrate their geospatial skills. And that's not to say that you can't use it for content. I'll show you what another, don't know why it's asking me to log in. I'll show you what another teacher has shared with me. So he shared this with me, and it will go up on our website very soon, but something like, I think it's this one. So he's exploring biodiversity, climate, and land cover with his students in class. This is Dane. He's given me permission. But he starts his lesson off by exploring one great resource you might make use for your IA2, so your assessment response. Explores Queensland imagery, gets his students to have a go, and explains why he would use Queensland imagery instead of Google Maps. So this isn't even ArcGIS Online, but it's the best geospatial technology tool for the job. And then he starts exploring some content, biodiversity, biodiversity hotspots, and this is an ArcGIS Online map. So again, using the best tool for the job, a student task, and then finishes the lesson off with a quick GIS challenge for his students. Gives them the instructions that they have to work through, but he essentially wants them to create this map with the features of bolts on here, or the cartographic conventions. But it's that little skill that he's getting them to do that's going to be necessary for their assessment piece later in the term. Otherwise, we're right on time. That pretty much brings us to an end of the webinar. Before we go, here's an opportunity to ask any questions. So if you did have any questions, please feel free to start typing them into the question box and submitting them. Otherwise, it would be awesome if you can take the time to give some feedback too. It's a 2-minute survey, but this is using Survey 1233, so I guess it's a good user experience, and we're all professionals at pointing our phones, camera at a screen or at a barcode now when we've entered restaurants. But if you point your phone's camera at the screen, at the QR code, it should pop up with a little internet tab to open up the survey. It'd be great to get your feedback. And the reason I ask for your feedback, especially with this onboarding program, is so that I can better it in the future. If you're finding the emails, if you're a part of the onboarding program and you're finding the emails a little bit, there's a little bit too much happening each week, getting feedback on that's great for me, because I can reduce those emails or I can look to shorten them. Same with the webinars like today. If you've got suggestions for other webinar topics, or you don't find one so useful, it's actually really helpful to know that, because I don't want to. I understand completely, having been there, that a teacher's time is super important and super tight. And I don't want to be wasting it if it's not really useful and you're not getting something out of it. And I want to be perfecting it and making it better, optimizing it, so that you do get more out of it. So if you can find some time to fill out that survey, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, a couple of places I want to share with you is, again, the Esri Australia's education website. So if I return to the education website, hopefully you can see really clearly in the search bar, esriaustralia.com.au/GIS-for-schools. And if I was you, I would bookmark the page just so you can find it quite easily. And here you can access learning materials, you can access professional development. And by that, I mean there's video tutorials and how-to guides on a range of topics like Survey 123, like story maps, ArcGIS Online, and so forth. So it's a really good place for resources, especially when it comes to using ArcGIS. We're all sitting in this one at the moment. You'll find that final onboarding webinar happens in a couple of weeks' time, but a really good website to bookmark and save. And you can access the learning materials and PD resources there. Again, as promised, this story map is the URL is there for you to copy down if you did want to access it. https://arcg.is/0. Now always make sure I get to the 0 just so that people don't think it's an O, and then the rest of it. Otherwise, if you're looking for some extra help, again, feel free to reach out to me, education@esriaustralia.com.au, and I would be more than happy to assist. It looks like I've got 0 questions today, which is awesome. We all get to get out a little bit easily. So in finishing, again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your hour this afternoon. Hopefully you've gotten something out of it, and hopefully I'll either hear from you or see you again at the next webinar. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye.